Okay, thanks, Ray, and thanks everyone for joining. I want to talk about measuring motivations and emotions. And in my kind of history and market research, I've always known how important this is, but I've always kind of struggled with how difficult researchers tend to make it. So kind of giving me the impression at times that you needed a PhD in psychology and 4-hour focus groups and kind of lots of analysis time to really understand what drives people's behavior. So I've spent a lot of time trying to kind of solve that problem and make things simple, quick, and intuitive, and that's really what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to kind of cover off 3 challenges, I think, and the kind of number one, we all understand that emotions are things that we kind of experience as kind of bodily sensations as much, maybe even more than as thoughts. So they're very experiential. They're very difficult to express often, even in the English language, which is kind of my main language. They can be very difficult to express. And the third thing I want to talk about is cultural differences, because the latest thinking on emotion is really that they're very similar to perceptions in that they're kind of constructs of the brain. And one of the implications of that, which should be obvious to anyone who's worked across different countries, is that culture shapes how people feel and how they react and what's important to them. So that's, again, hopefully something I'll cover off as we go through the presentation. And just to sort of add a little bit of flesh to that, obviously there are market researchers and market research approaches that are visual, but in general, research is still very kind of verbal. That's something any of you have heard me speak before, will have heard me rant about. But I think actually this issue of language is perhaps one of the big barriers to really kind of developing approaches that are more simple and kind of intuitive. This issue of translation, I think, is partly an issue about actually having the language, but it's also an issue of how you translate at all. And I think Octavio Paz got it right when he kind of basically what he's saying is that you can always translate language and words in a kind of very literal way, but it's impossible to translate the meaning. And particularly not just across languages, but more broadly across cultures. Which leads me to my third point on the cultural dimension. So I think many of you might be familiar with motivational models, but the model and the framework I'm using here has been very much informed by the cross-cultural research that's been done on human values, and there's quite a lot of that, as well as the sort of more generic motivational models, which usually come down to 2 key dimensions between independence and interdependence, and freedom versus kind of control and stability. So using that kind of framework with 12 different motivational segments, what I've done is to test 36 concepts, so 3 from each of those segments, both as words and as the equivalent pictures. In fact, there are multiple picture sets that were tested, but I'm going to focus on one of them today. And what you see in front of you now is the results for the test of words, and there's based on a very simple question to 1,200 women across 4 countries, 2 in Asia and 2 kind of more Western cultures. And the question was, think about the beauty that you desire for yourself. Which of these 3 words, or later 3 pictures, best represent the beauty you desire? It's a very straightforward question, and what you can see from the results here is that it's all about confidence. And I'm sorry that the Thai script seems to have kind of thrown a wobbly, but this really suggests that all there is to beauty is that women want to feel confident, and more than half of the women chose that individual concept out of 36. And actually quite a lot of them also chose charismatic, which falls within the same motivational segment. But we then get into a kind of a bit of a bun fight between the rest of the concepts, the emotional concepts here, and it's not very clear what the differences are. All these results tell us is that confidence is important. And if I aggregate that data across 12 segments, you'll see that they're really, really skewed towards confidence. And as I said, that includes the term confident, but also the concept of being charismatic. And that's true in all the countries. And really, the only other difference you can pull out from this data at an aggregate level is that courage or independence is more important in Western countries. It's less important in Indonesia than in the other countries, but the rest is kind of a little bit of a mess. Now, why is this happening? I think there's a couple of reasons. I think the first is purely that when we use words, we're kind of invoking the rational brain and the literal brain. And confidence is obviously, when you're talking about beauty, many of you will have expected confidence to be important, which of course it is. But I think that's kind of an obvious and a literal answer. I think there's a second, that's maybe some translation issues as well, which I can address in the Q&A if you want. But I think then another issue is that when people use the word confidence, does it actually mean something very precise, or is it quite a general term? And I think the answer is that, and backed up by some other qual research I've done, is that confidence means different things to different people in different countries on different occasions. So it's not a very precise term, and I think the results from the picture survey will show you why. So same question, 36 pictures which were chosen to match the verbal concepts, but they're all kind of generic Western pictures, as I tested some other sets of pictures, but I'll show you these because they were tested across all 4 countries. And here are the results. So you'll see in the bottom of this chart, there are 2 pictures in each of the columns. Those represent the number 1 and number 2 visual concept in each country. So what can we learn from this? Well, confident is still an important idea, but it's not overwhelmingly important as it was with the verbal responses. And in fact, it's although it's number 1 in 2 countries, it's number 2 in the other 2 countries. So in Australia, powerful, the girl in the gym, is more strongly associated with ideal beauty, whereas in Thailand, the sort of hopeful, optimistic lady is slightly wins over confident. But overall, these results are quite interesting because the top 5 concepts are consistent across all 4 countries, although they appear in a different order. So the priorities of women in the countries are different. And the biggest difference, if you look, is that confidence and power are number 1 and number 2 in the UK and Australia. And hopeful is number 5 in those 2 countries, whereas in Indonesia and Thailand, confident and hopeful are the number 1 and number 2, whereas powerful is the 5th. And then 3rd and 4th place in all the countries are kind of enjoyment and fun and feeling individual. So a lot of consistency, but also a kind of quite clear cultural difference, which completely makes sense from what I know about the countries. And I've lived in 2 of them, and I know the other 2 quite well. And if I visualize that, you'll see there's kind of 5, as you can see, broad areas that are pretty consistently the most important for women. So it's confidence, courage, although that's a big difference between sort of different countries, the area of discovery and feeling individual, the area of fun, and the area of kind of innocence or idealism. So that's great. These are 3 main pictures. There's still 3 main pictures, but as well as kind of showing relatively consistent results across the 5 countries, you know, we're talking to women and we're talking about beauty, so we'd expect that there's quite a lot of universality about this, but there is a big cultural difference, and the biggest one is in this area of courage at the top of the chart, or which is a more kind of an area of independence and about yourself, where of course, whereas it won't be a surprise that the Western countries are valuing that much more than the Asian countries, with Indonesia as the kind of lowest on that. So that's why we get this kind of difference between confidence and courage being more important in the Western cultures, which are much more about independence and ego, whereas innocence becoming much more important in the 2 Asian countries, and that's kind of pulling down much more towards interdependence, and particularly about people's relationship with nature and the environment and so on. So that kind of makes complete sense in terms of the cultural differences. So to me, that those visual responses give a kind of much more realistic and a much more, I think, culturally nuanced take on what's important for women in beauty. So hopefully that might convince you that there are ways which are a little bit simpler, quicker, and more intuitive in measuring motivations, measuring emotions, and capturing the essence of what people value and what's important to them. And not only that, they're more engaging, they're more fun, and they take less time. So in an online survey, that one question would take less than a minute for virtually all the participants. Moreover, when you're using those visuals, so I use them across all 4 countries, they weren't translated. They didn't need translation, and every respondent in every country saw the same stimulus. Now, I know that that's not true with words because I had to translate them, and it took some time to do it properly. But even then, they don't mean exactly the same things. And I think probably also an issue that they're, particularly in an Asian context, maybe not specific enough about the context, because a lot of communication, and particularly so in Asian countries, is context rather than what's actually said. And I think most importantly, I believe this is really kind of pulling out both kind of universal aspects of what's important to people, but also sort of the granularity of local cultural differences. So I would urge everyone to try and get more visual in your research process, and I think you'll get closer to some of those truths. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Neil.